Welcome back to lesson 5-5, Roosevelt and the New Deal. We're going to start to look today at how the United States tries to pull itself out of this Great Depression it has fallen into. It begins with the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Roosevelt took office, and in his very first speech, his inaugural speech, he said to the American people, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Here being the idea that the economy is bad because we believe it is bad, and because we think that we'll never pull out of this. And because we think that we'll never pull out of it, we're acting in a way that actually makes our problems worse. So together, we need to work to overcome our fears and to embrace the changes in society that we need to pull ourselves out of this Great Depression. And to come up with those ideas and those policies and those programs, he created a group called the Brain Trust. The Brain Trust was a group of professors and economists, people whose job it was to think about government. These aren't people with a lot of experience of doing, more experience with thinking about and theories, but they helped him create some plans to recover the economy. And in this case, it works pretty well. All right, first thing they need to do was reorganize the banks. The banks were a big part of the problem. They were collapsing, falling apart throughout the country. People were panicking and rushing to them to withdraw their money. So the first thing he did is he closed all banks. All banks in the United States closed. Nobody can get their money. Nobody can take it out. Nobody can get a loan. All banks are closed. And then slowly, the government examined these banks and reopened them when they determined that this bank is safe. And the idea being that if the government says this bank is safe and they're reopening that bank, people won't panic and rush to it to withdraw their money. President Roosevelt has said this one is good. This one is fine. And he does this, he assures them in what becomes his first of many, many fireside chats. This is what he called his radio programs. The idea that people would sit at home by their fireplace, turn on the radio, and listen to the president. It was supposed to feel like you were having a conversation with President Roosevelt. He was just talking to you about his plans and what he hoped to accomplish. And in this very first one, he convinced the American people that the banks that were reopening were safe. And when they did reopen, the banks slowly recovered. It wasn't a miraculous thing, but over time, the banks got better. Now, Roosevelt saw other success in his first 100 days as president. Actually, so much success that presidents nowadays are all compared to Roosevelt's first 100 days. It's like a measuring stick. What did you do, President Trump or President Obama, in your first 100 days? This is what Roosevelt accomplished. In his first 100 days, he convinced Congress to pass a lot of what he called his New Deal programs. America needs a New Deal. The idea being we had a bad deal before. This is going to be the New Deal to help Americans through the Great Depression. And these New Deal programs focused on what Roosevelt called his 3 R's. The 3 R's. R number 1, relief. This is relief for the jobless and the hungry. We're going to get you a job. We're going to get you food. R number 1 is relief. Number 2 is recovery. We're going to help industry and agriculture recover. Those factories, we need to get them up and running again. Those farms, we need to get them producing food again. We need to help them recovery. Second R, recovery. Third R, reform. This is to make sure that we don't have these mistakes happen again. Let's try to reform the government and the economy to make sure that we don't have another Great Depression. 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform. And to do this and to make sure that this happened, Roosevelt created several government programs. In the first 100 days in office, he created all of these guys over here: the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, Public Works Administration, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, Tennessee Valley Authority, Civilian Conservation Corps, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the National Recovery Administration. We're not going to get into what all of these are, but all of these were organizations that helped to restore confidence in the American economy. Alrighty. So we have 100 days, responses to the New Deal. So how do Americans feel about these first 100 days? Well, conservatives, kind of predictably, think that it gave government too much power. We're taking power out of the hands of business to do whatever they want and to run the country however they want, and taking it onto the government. Liberals believe that it didn't go far enough, that at the end of the New Deal, there would still be too many jobless, hungry people, too many industries that were in collapse. The government needed to do more to take control of the economy. This is usually a sign that we're on the right track. If conservatives and liberals both think that you don't, go quite in the right direction, means you're kind of going a middle route, which is a safe bet in most cases. Now, the New Deal itself did not end the Great Depression. The Great Depression does not end because of the New Deal. Our problems were much bigger than you could solve in 100 days. But it slowed dramatically the downward slide in the economy. We were no longer heading to a cliff that we were going to drop off of and just fall forever. No, we were still falling, but now we're falling slower. And people are starting to think that the economy might be able to recover. That idea that it might be able to recover spurred a second New Deal. This was encouraged by Democratic wins in the congressional elections of 1934. So Roosevelt's been president for 2 years. The New Deal has been in place for 2 years. The economy has gotten less bad. So let's try it again. Let's expand the New Deal. Let's give more relief to the poor, more relief to the elderly. Let's go another round of this and see if that will finally end the Great Depression. The most famous program that came out of the New Deal era was part of the Second New Deal, and that was Social Security. The Social Security Act is the best known and most popular still to this day of all New Deal programs. In Social Security, what Americans do is a portion of every paycheck that we earn, every time we get paid at our job, a portion of our salary, of what we get paid, goes directly into a government program called Social Security. We don't get it. It doesn't go to us directly. It goes to Social Security. But what that does is it creates this big, huge bucket of money that we get to withdraw money from once we retire. So once we get to retirement age, 65 or 67 or 70 or whatever it is by the time you retire, by the time you get to that age and you no longer have a job, you're no longer earning money for yourself, the government will send you a check every month in Social Security. You paid into it your whole life. Now that you're retirement age and you're no longer working, the government will pay you back. So you will never be absolutely broke. Roosevelt is easily reelected because of the support of people who benefited from his New Deal programs, especially, number one, the poor. New Deal programs really targeted help to the poor, and this was really almost all Americans during the Depression. Almost all Americans were poor during the Depression, so the poor showed up and voted for Roosevelt. And number two was African Americans. African Americans had voted largely for the party of Lincoln, Republicans, ever since Ulysses S. Grant, ever since the 15th Amendment granted voting rights to African Americans. But the Republican Party was no longer the party of representing the people or the poor. This was for the wealthy and for businessmen. And there were very few wealthy African American businessmen at this time. And African Americans start to recognize that the Republicans aren't looking out for their interest, and they shift their alliances, their allegiances to the Democratic Party, where it has remained since this time. Roosevelt didn't go through a presidency without any problems, though. In 1935, the United States Supreme Court started to check some of the powers of President and Congress. President was a Democrat, Congress was Democrats, but most of the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court were Republicans and appointed by Republicans and didn't believe that the government should have all of this power to do all these changes. So they started to look at the New Deal programs and started to say, these programs are not constitutional. They're not legal. So we're going to have to put a stop to some of them. And Roosevelt looks at this and he says, well, if the Supreme Court thinks that this New Deal is not constitutional, then I guess we just need a new Supreme Court. And in 1937, Roosevelt proposed a law, to increase the Supreme Court to 15 members, to change it from 9 to 15. And this would allow him to appoint 6 new justices. And you better believe all 6 of these justices would be in favor of the New Deal. Roosevelt would have been able to do anything he wanted if the Supreme Court had his appointees on it. But the public were like, wait a minute, this is authoritarian. This is not good. We don't want a president with this much power. We see what this is doing in Europe. Hitler is starting to rise during this time. And we don't want anything like that here. We don't want somebody with that much power. So the public said absolutely no. And they were joined by Republicans and Democrats. Republicans and Democrats both said, no, we don't want a dictator president. So no, Roosevelt, you don't get to do this. And Roosevelt's idea of packing the court with his supporters was smacked down. He did not get that. Roosevelt also lost some of his momentum and some of his support for New Deal programs when the economy slipped. In 1937, things got bad again. Not as bad as they were in 1929, 1930, 31, but it was the worst year since Roosevelt had been president. And people started to question whether or not his ideas were working. And one of those people who questioned it was Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt began to get nervous about government spending and starting to think that government spending was getting too high. And what if this doesn't work? We're borrowing a lot of money. We're going in debt as a nation. What if this doesn't work? And there were economists around him who were saying, no, Roosevelt, the only problem is that we're still not spending enough money. As much as we're spending, we need to spend more and more and more to encourage the growth of this economy. Economists said, spend more. Roosevelt and the rest of the American people were starting to think, we might be spending too much. And so they slowed down their programs. We do learn in another few years that the economists in 1937 were right. We did need more spending. But Roosevelt was nervous. Roosevelt hesitated. He slowed down government spending, and the Great Depression will crawl on for another 5 years. That was it for today, and Roosevelt's approach to this. We'll be looking at the impacts of the Great Depression on people in our next lesson. I hope you enjoyed this one, and farewell.